Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Bajer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
That's the other sign of a really healthy culture, is that disagreements are resolved at the level at which they happen. Now, of course, that assumes clear expectations, right? Clear strategy. That's a whole other issue. But assuming you have that, for people to resolve those issues at the level at which they exist is a really wonderful thing. And for people to hold each other accountable.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 128 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrained connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrained. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. So today we delve into a topic that is universally challenging, but rarely addressed with the nuance it deserves. Work relationships. I mean, let's be honest, all relationships are hard, but work relationships can be especially tricky to handle due to the inherent power dynamics and the high stakes involved. Our career progress and financial stability often hang in the balance. So in this episode, we are focusing on a particularly thorny aspect of workplace dynamics, dealing with difficult people at work. I've certainly had my fair share of difficult colleagues at work in the past, and I know from firsthand experience that the stress of navigating tough personalities can really take a toll. It dampens our creativity, affects our productivity, and can really cloud our ability to think straight and make sound decisions. That's why I'm excited about today's conversation. We have the privilege of hosting Amy Gallo, a distinguished workplace expert and host of a Harvard Business Review podcast. Amy's perspective on working with difficult folks is truly enlightening. She suggests that conflict, when approached thoughtfully and managed skillfully, can be a catalyst for creating a workplace where everyone can excel. Amy is also the acclaimed author of Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People, and the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict. If you want to reshape your approach to workplace challenges and harness the potential of conflict as a positive force, I think you've come to the right place. Without further ado, here is the brilliant Amy Gallo.
I'm Amy Gallo. I'm the author of two books, one called The HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, and the other is called Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People.
Amy, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so happy that you joined us. I really can't wait to dive into the topic because it's such an important one for our listeners and for the organizations out there. But before we go there, there's this one question. Our listeners already know that because I always ask it. It's the first question. I'd love to know, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? How did you grow up?
There are two things I'll say that really, I think, influenced who I became, who I am now, the kind of work I do. One is that I grew up with a single mom. So my parents were divorced when I was young. My mom hadn't worked prior to the divorce and then started a career and actually built a 40-year-long career as a lobbyist here in the US in the state General Assembly in Connecticut. and she represented nonprofit clients in the General Assembly, basically advocating for civil rights, women's rights, lots of different organizations. Yeah. And I grew up in a suburb in Connecticut that was, I wouldn't say conservative. It was a pretty progressive, but it was conservative in that I was often one of the only few people I knew who had divorced parents. And so I never felt bad about that, but it was a mark of something different. And I actually ended up taking great pride both in my mom and the career she built, but also in, being a little bit different. And often there was a lot of judgment I could feel from others, and really thriving as a family despite that judgment was really something I took great pride in. The second thing is actually connected, which is some of the work that my mom did was around LGBTQ plus rights in the state of Connecticut. This was in the early 80s, when this was not a topic that many people were talking about or willing to address. And because of that, she actually brought in several sort of, I think of them as father figures, gay men who helped to raise me and my brother. And it was just a unique way of being raised, to have many different parental figures, but also to be included in this culture, which in many places was still countercultural, and but included in this culture of what it meant to love who you loved and what it meant to choose who your family was, right? We aren't necessarily connected by blood to our family. We're connected by the choice to, as one of our family members puts it, to be dedicated irrationally to one another's well-being. And that really affected the way I think about culture, the way I think about family and relationships and connections, and also having my mom be who she was, also think about how it affected how I think about careers and what's important to us.
I love that. Thank you for sharing your story. It's such an interesting one, and a lot of really powerful influences. A strong female figure in your life so early on, and being exposed to people who are not in the mainstream of the society, at least back then, and getting these influences, and yourself feeling a little bit perhaps on the margin because of coming from a different family. I can totally see how it shapes a person and how they show up later on in their life. So I'm curious, when you look back at these experiences, is there a connection between how you grew up and all these influences and the focus of your work today? Because you have decided, I don't know how intentional that was, or maybe you fell into it. I'd love to learn. You decided to focus your expertise on work relationships and on conflict in the workplace. What was that path? What was the path that led you to be focusing and devoting so much of your time and energy on this topic?
That's where my mom's influence really comes in, because she built, as I mentioned, this career. She actually ended up running a lobbying firm, was incredibly successful. She was actually the first woman lobbyist in the state of Connecticut. I remember someone telling me this story about how they went to tour the state capitol with a different lobbyist. They were doing an internship, and someone pointed out my mother and said, "That's the hardest working woman in the building." I always remember that. And she will tell you right away, I never meant to do this, right? It happened accidentally. I thought she actually had been volunteering for the League of Women Voters, trying to get more women to vote. They needed someone to represent them at the state capitol. They said, "Would you do it?" She said, "Sure. I don't know what that means, but sure, I'll figure it out." Right. And that led from one thing to another, and ultimately to, like I said, this illustrious 40-year career where she had some major, major wins in the state capitol. And similar for me, if you had asked me, when I was a teenager, in college, even in my 20s, if I would be writing, talking about the topics I talk about, I would say, I don't think so. No. Right. And it was, I started out actually working in the nonprofit world. I was doing a lot of work around HIV prevention, both here in the US, but also abroad. I had studied Russian in college, so I lived in Russia for a year after college. I then realized I was never going to pay back my student loans doing that work. So I did a huge pivot to management consulting, which I didn't even really know what that was at the time. It was in management consulting that I actually found the passion. This was in my late 20s. I didn't love being a consultant and for a variety of reasons, but what I did find is that I would sit in these meetings where we're talking about strategy, operations, right? These big business ideas. And the thing I was drawn to was the interpersonal interactions between people. And I actually have this one very clear memory of walking out of a day long strategy meeting with a client and, brilliant minds in the room, tons of resources. They were very well funded organization, very successful. And I do believe the strategy on paper was quite brilliant. But I remember walking out and thinking that's not going to work because those people do not know how to actually have a conversation, right? They had to have us in the room in order to facilitate a cohesive conversation. And even then, they were sort of talking past each other. And that was the moment I went looking back, not at the time did I think, oh, I'm going to go write some books about conflict now. Looking back, I'm like, that was the moment where I was like, this is what's interesting to me. And that I really learned from my mom is follow what's interesting. Don't worry about the money. Don't worry about what the title of it is or what the role is. It will come together. And I know that's a privileged position to be in. And I'm grateful I was able to do that. And that's really where I ended up eventually starting to write articles and eventually these two books about interpersonal dynamics at work.
I think one of the commonalities I see between you and your mom is also following your curiosity 100% and also this desire to live a life of service, because you certainly do. I know that you are influencing a lot of people in the workplace in a very positive way. And I know how much effort and time it takes to produce the kind of work that you do. You've already mentioned you wrote two books. One was a guide to dealing with conflict. The other one, Getting Along, how to work with anyone, even the difficult people. And I want to ask, how do you view the relationship between conflict and getting along?
Ultimately, I feel that being able to navigate conflict is the true test of a strong relationship. And whether that's a relationship between two people or between a team or within an organization. And I think oftentimes we think of getting along as having no conflict. And that's actually the opposite of how I see it, which is that if there's no conflict, chances are you're getting along, right? things are progressing perhaps. Maybe it feels good to be in interactions with that person, but you're not actually getting to the real core of what connects us, which is being able to navigate all of the ups and downs, being able to have hard times, being able to recognize there are differences between us, the way we work, the way we communicate, the way we think, and we can come together over those differences and still do whatever it is we're doing, whether that's producing a product or carrying out an initiative or simply just existing together in the same office or in the same house, right? I think conflict is an essential part of what I think of as love. And I know a lot of people are like, "Ooh, love in the workplace, that's a little," and I really, what I mean by that is what a lot of researchers call companionate love, which is not romantic love like we think of love, but the investment in one another's well-being and caring about one another's success.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually like talking about love in the workplace as well. And I know that a lot of people consider it to be a dirty word, but that's fine. I think that I'd rather use a dirty word than just accept that work itself, it becomes kind of dirty and dehumanizing. I really love this point about the fact that the sign of a healthy relationship is how well we can navigate conflict. I sometimes say that a clear sign of a great team is not the superficial harmony, but actually the intellectual friction that people can have. That intellectual friction that happens between people who love each other in that way or who appreciate each other and enjoy working together. And I know that in most cases with healthy relationships, people find a way to get to this point where they navigate conflict to a certain extent, but it is challenging. One of my questions to set the context for the conversation is what makes it so challenging? Because if we want to be honest, for the majority of us, I think we'd rather arm wrestle a grizzly bear than than have a conflict with someone who's really important for us at work or at home. Can you speak to this a little bit?
It's just human nature. I mean, that's sort of what it comes down to, is that our survival as humans is dependent on existing with other people. We rely on them for emotional needs, actual needs, right? Food, housing, right? We exist in communities. Having a conflict threatens that connection. So I think that just at a very basic human level, we are hardwired for likability, right? Because that's how we survive. Add on to that this layer of sort of how conflict is thought of in society. And it varies, of course, from culture to culture. Some cultures are more comfortable with direct confrontation. Some are quite conflict averse. In the culture I work in the US, we're more comfortable with confrontation than some cultures, but we really, especially in our workplaces, really value this sort of smiling, optimism, positivity, connection. Oh, we all see the same, see things the same way. And it feels good. I mean, think about the sort of rush you get when you say something and the room is like nodding along, going, oh my gosh, that's exactly right, Amy. Right. It feels so good. And that, I think, makes it the idea of sort of disrupting that harmony or potentially creating a rupture is really scary to us because of our basic humanness, but also because of what our cultural expectations, and I mean culture, sort of broader culture, but also our organizational culture, we're violating possibly those expectations. And then I think there's a third layer, which is that most of us, if you think of sort of conflict as wandering into this open field of like, I don't know what's going to happen. Most of us don't feel confident we know how we're going to navigate out. That's the piece I think many of us are never taught. Like, no one ever sat me down and was like, here's how you have a conflict and here's how you repair from that conflict after, right? Instead, we watch how people handle conflict. I mean, I think about the people I saw screaming at each other over some traffic issue this morning on the street. And I was like, these are the sort of models. Do you think about our political right environment, especially in the US, but in other places too, right? The way that people model how you handle conflict, it's just high intensity with no resolution, or we get along. It seems to feel black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think then there are these people in our lives that we genuinely believe are impossible to collaborate with or find some agreement with. We say, this person is a jerk or they're really, really difficult to work with. Actually, there's some research that indicates that it's true to a certain extent that one bad apple can really spoil the barrel. Will Phelps, a professor at Rotterdam School of Management in the Netherlands, he designed this simple experiment to see the impact of individuals with negative approach on a team. Actually, by the way, some of these individuals fit the archetypes of difficult coworkers that you share in Getting Along. The result of this experiment is that having a bad team member is like having a fast-spreading virus. It can infect the rest of the team almost instantaneously. But you emphasize something really important in Getting Along, that the issue isn't so much the individual, but the interaction that we have with them. Tell me more about that.
And I do think the bad apple research is interesting. I'm thinking about some research that came out of actually Harvard Business School where they talk about toxic colleagues and how it's so much less costly to avoid hiring one than trying to actually get rid of one, because the influence it has on the team, you not only is it about firing that person, but then it's about undoing the damage they've caused. But what you're asking about in terms of how do we separate this person, so there's a difference between someone who's, let's say, pessimistic, right? And that's one of the archetypes in the book is the pessimist, versus someone who's like really just constantly putting down ideas, is demeaning to others, right? all of these things are contagious: positive emotions, negative attitudes. But really, you are not going to change who that person is. And there's lots of research that shows that some people just are naturally pessimistic. That's their outlook on life for whatever reason that is. And you're not going to change that. And I think trying to reform someone who you find challenging is a really daunting task. I don't know many people who are good at it, but what you can try to change is the way you interact. So just because they have a pessimistic attitude doesn't mean you have to tolerate them putting down everyone's ideas. And you can, through your own behavior and perhaps through the behavior of the team, setting team norms, agreeing on how you all are going to interact or handle negativity, you can nudge that person not to be a different person, but to show up differently to the meetings that are there, possibly causing damage. And
Such an important point, coming back to, I think that's truth that we all know, of course, but for some reason often refuse to accept, that we really can't change others. We often struggle to change ourselves. And so I think it's only fair to say that probably changing someone is going to be close to impossible. And it's so much better to focus on our energy and time on changing how we interact with them. So it makes total sense to me. And I wonder, Amy, if you can share a little bit more about how exactly can I do that? What are the things that I need to think about when I have, let's say that I have actually a colleague that is quite demeaning. Let's go to that super difficult scenario. And in the space of culture, we often talk about brilliant jerks. I think it's a good example. So someone with great technical skills and someone who doesn't even consider that having empathy and thinking about others' needs is part of their job. And so they are just completely inconsiderate of others. If you are faced with this situation at work, what are the strategies or tactics that you can implement to navigate that?
I want to answer that. I also want to just touch on briefly this idea that you can't change another person, because it's a bit trite. Like, people always say you can't change another person. But I think that one of the things is, even though we know that, we still try.
Yeah,
And that leads me
exactly.
to, right? That leads me to answer your question about the brilliant jerk, which is that, like, I think in our heads, we think if they could just be better, right? If they could just be less of a jerk, if they could just be less insecure, less arrogant, whatever it is that's bothering you, that's not in your control. And waiting for that to happen, or even trying to make that happen, sometimes makes the situation worse. And so, really, I think the first thing you want to think about is, what are the problematic behaviors? Not like what's wrong with this person as an individual, because that list might be long. You might have a lot of things to say, but what are the problematic behaviors, right? Are they demeaning in meetings, right? And trying to be as specific as possible. Are they rude over email? Are they not open to feedback? Are they stuck in their ways and won't hear about a different way of working, right? Whatever those are, focus on those things. Okay, so let's say there's someone who chronically interrupts people in meetings or talks over them. Oh, that's a problematic behavior that you can actually hopefully do something about. And so I think that's the first thing, is really figuring out what are the behaviors. The second is then figure out a goal, because your goal may be to show them that that behavior is unacceptable, but perhaps in their world, it is acceptable. And when I say in their world, I mean maybe from the culture they came from, maybe from the previous work they've done, maybe the family they grew up in, right? I had once had a coaching client who was, the biggest piece of feedback that he got was interrupting, talking over people. And we sort of, as we started to dig into it, he's like, I come from a big family. We talk over it. Like, there's four people talking at the same time all the time. It's just normal to me. I don't know. He didn't even grasp why it was upsetting to others, right? So I think that's the other thing, is figuring out, okay, rather than your goal being to show them that everything's wrong, the goal is to reduce the number of times they interrupt, right? The goal is, and to try to sort of take the judgment out of it. You can describe the effect the interruption has on you, right? It's very hard for me to concentrate. I lose my train of thought. Or if, let's say you can say, I see the team gets totally off track when you're talking over people, whatever it is, you can share the impact it's having without saying it's wrong to interrupt, because they may not believe that. And that's not universally true. I think most of us probably think interrupting is bad, but again, not everyone feels that way. And then you have to sort of just experiment with different tactics. So perhaps you can, if depending on your relationship with the person, depending on your sort of positional power in the organization, you might have a direct conversation and just say, hey, one of the things that you're doing, I think that's really holding you back and really harming the team is these interruptions. I don't even know if you know you're doing it. I'm sure it's not your intention, right? That's a key communication there. I'm sure it's not your intention. But what happens is I notice the team gets off track, or I personally lose my train of thought. And I feel like we're not getting to the deeper discussions we need to have when that happens, right? You don't need to get into, I think you're insecure, you're being arrogant because you're trying to prove yourself, all that. You don't need to do it, right? So the direct approach, you might try an indirect approach, which is have a team discussion around how do we want to handle meetings, right? If you're the manager of the team, introduce 3 rules around team meetings. Maybe we have an agenda ahead of time. We don't interrupt. We allow people to finish their thoughts. If someone does interrupt, we gently nudge them to not, right? And then maybe the third thing is that we do a round robin at the end to make sure all voices were heard. Whatever those norms are, you can use those norms to try to get this sort of interrupter, this brilliant jerk, to participate in a more productive way.
I've noticed actually the second approach being implemented quite often in teams. And I imagine that one of the reasons for this is our aversion to conflict. Because I guess it's easier to be quite generic and say, hey guys, we need some norms when it comes to how we run our meetings than confronting this person individually and having a difficult conversation with them. And you've already spoken to why it's so incredibly difficult for us. Our brains are basically wired to survive, and antagonizing others, especially if they're valued by the organization, is quite terrifying. And so I wonder whether you have any advice as to A, how we can pluck the courage to have this difficult conversation with this person. And you've already mentioned how we might approach it. We should be focusing on behaviors and the problem, not the person. Is there anything else that we should keep in mind to make sure that A, we feel relatively comfortable as much as possible, of course, and B, so that our message lands? Because I think the ultimate goal, obviously, is that something's going to change as a result of this conversation.
Oh gosh, there's a lot in that question. I think one of the things I do agree, we often use these norms as ways to avoid a difficult conversation. But I will say there's other benefits. I mean, if everyone on the team is sitting there going, Amy's that brilliant jerk, this is terrible, and then you passive aggressively be like, we have a new norm around not interrupting, right? Like, of course, like that's avoiding the conflict. But there are so many other benefits to setting those norms. Like, for example, maybe you have an introvert who doesn't actually ever speak up because they're afraid of being interrupted. So if you have this new norm around not being interrupted, maybe that gives that person a little bit more courage to speak up, right? So I think it is when it's a clear passive aggressive move to try to reform someone else's behavior, I don't think that's appropriate. But remember, there's so many other benefits to developing those norms. Now, to have the specific conversation with the person, it takes courage. And I think one of the things to remember is your brain is going to play out all the ways it could go terribly wrong, right? You won't be listened to. You'll start crying. They'll start yelling. They'll report you to HR, right? Like you're going to think about all those things. That's our natural negativity bias. But you also have to think about what are the risks of not saying something, right? And that's often those are greater than the risks and more realistic, right? Because it's the given. Sometimes actually when I'm afraid to have a difficult conversation, which as someone who speaks and talks about this, I still do have those fears, is I'll write down, well, okay, what are my fears? 1, 2, 3. How likely are they on a scale of 1 to 10? And that really helps me put it in perspective. The other thing I think is, I mentioned that sort of communication tactic of, I don't imagine it's your intention that you want to make people feel unheard. the minute you start giving someone feedback, they're going to start questioning, do you think I'm a good person or not? Right. And so the more you indicate you think they're a good person who's just participating in some behavior that's having a negative consequence, that's manageable for them. If you tell me I'm an arrogant jerk who doesn't have any like real connections with my colleagues, where do I start on fixing that? Right. But if you tell me, I don't think it's your intention, but this is what happens, then okay, all right, I can hold back from interrupting people, right? I can wash myself or I can apologize when I do it. Maybe that's the first step, right? The other piece, so I think you really want to sort of separate, that's a little bit of separating the people from the problem, but it's also giving them the out of like, this is your behavior, it's not you. But then the other thing is also to think about what is it they actually care about? Because it's possible, and I've known many brilliant jerks for whom this is true, they don't care about other people's feelings. They're sitting there going, "Get a thicker skin. What? This is not my problem. Like I'm getting work done here. Do you see how brilliant I am?" Right? So what is it they actually care about? And can you talk about the behavior as getting in the way of that, right? Of like, I know you care about this initiative that we're trying to get done and half the time we should, right? And what's going to hold us back is if the team's not able to participate productively. I sense the team's holding back right now because they feel like you don't value their input because of these interruptions. Even presented as an experiment. Like, let's just see what happens, like in the next 3 meetings, if we really watch the interruptions, like how it changes the dynamic. It's hard because sometimes I'll get pushback from people who are like, you're doing all this work when really they should just get their act together and stop being a jerk, right? And I get that. But this is a lot of work you're doing. And to me, and everyone has to make their own evaluation in the situation, but to me, it generally is worth it because you end up feeling better about the way you behaved. You've addressed a problem that maybe is not just affecting you, but affecting others. And the other option of waiting around for them to get their act together, well, I mean, that could be a long time. And so, yeah, is it really their responsibility to not be a jerk? Yes, but they're not taking that. They're not taking that opportunity. So, what are my other options? Do I want to leave? Do I want to quit? Do I want to not be on this team anymore? Do I want to let the project fail? Like, those are all options, but you have to sort of evaluate how much effort you put into those other options as well, or even just sort of tolerating the current situation versus taking steps, taking the responsibility to address.
Yeah, totally. I so agree with that. That's what I see in the space of culture and shaping culture as well, that very often we will be faced with certain aspects of how we do things around here that we don't enjoy and we think that they shouldn't be happening. Usually, of course, it's behaviors from our colleagues. But somehow I think for a lot of us, we have this mindset that it's almost like the weather. It's not great, but it feels like there's nothing we can do about it. And I think we're both asking people in our work to do the hard work of creating change, and especially behavioral change. It is difficult. And I love how you frame it and this invitation that you extend to people to think about, right, but if I don't do the hard work, what are my other options and what are the consequences going to be? And can I live with these consequences, including how we feel about ourselves? I think that's important too, because if we don't stand up for something that we feel is important, then how are we going to be feeling about ourselves a year from now? I think it's really important. So I love that moment of reflection. What are my fears? How real are they? And also, what are the risks of addressing it versus not? And very often, I think we find that actually it's not as scary. And I'd much rather live with the consequences of the confrontation than with the consequences of this behavior escalating and infecting the rest of the team.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't always go well in the moment. I mean, I think about a conversation. Something happened on a team I was working on where someone made a comment that could have been interpreted as racist. I actually didn't interpret it that way initially until another colleague of mine pointed it out. And I was like, oh gosh, yeah, that's problematic. I felt a responsibility to say something. I had 2 days of, like, stomach ache, like, just I was just like, "Oh my god," and really I mean, talk about taking my own advice, right? Like, I really had to, like, really work hard, and the reaction from the person who had made the comment was terrible. She was defensive. She said that wasn't true. The way I was interpreting was completely off base. I sort of went back and said, "Okay, I hear you. However, that I do believe this is how it could be interpreted. I think it was interpreted this way by others on the team." And she just shut me out. If you had asked me the day of that conversation how it went, I would say 0 out of 10, right? Really, maybe 1 out of 10 because neither of us quit, right? So it was a 1. I found out 3 months later, someone else who knows that person said, "Oh, by the way, she said you gave her some really helpful feedback." And I was like, "What?" Like, and I think that's the thing to keep in mind. And I have to say, raising a teenager is this way too. I have a 16-year-old daughter. Is I often say something, I get this terrible reaction, and then a month later, I'm like, "Oh, she's doing it," right? And I think that's the thing. Not to equate difficult colleagues with teenagers, but I think you have to remember the speaking up in itself is the courageous thing to do. The chances that your colleague's going to go, "Oh, wow, yeah, I interrupt all the time. I can be a real jerk. I'm going to stop that immediately." Right? 0% chance that that's going to happen. More likely it's going to be messy, but having the conversation is the win. Ultimately, hopefully the behavior changes as well. Maybe not immediately, maybe not even at all, but at least you've said something that you can feel good about.
I really believe in planting seeds, as you say, because I totally resonate with that. That has been my experience as well. I've seen even, the feedback that I've received and felt defensive about. And I know that I need to marinate a little bit in what I hear sometimes, especially when it's courageous feedback that sheds light on my blind spots. And so I might not yell at people, generally speaking, maybe my husband sometimes, but generally at work, I wouldn't yell at people when they give me difficult feedback. But I need some time. And so I totally resonate with that. And I think that being realistic about the impact that we're going to have in the moment is such an important thing to keep in mind, and maybe not getting too attached to an outcome. I love that. Amy, I know that you wrote this book about navigating conflict, and a lot of people, and then of course about how to get along with almost everyone at work and do great work together. And I know that you do a lot of speaking and interact with your audience, with the people who read your books and listen to your interviews. What is a question that is most frequently asked by team leaders or managers? What is the key challenge that they find around conflict in the workplace?
One of the things I hear most often is, how do I get people to speak up? How do I get people to get over this conflict aversion and actually say what they mean? I hear from frustrated leaders who really feel like they're doing the right things to encourage that, and yet nothing actually is happening, right? They sense people have thoughts, feedback, ideas, opinions that they're just not voicing. And it's interesting, as someone who talks about conflict a lot, you'd think I would be brought into organizations where there's a ton of conflict, where it's quite the opposite. I'm more often brought in when there isn't enough conflict. So this is really a concern for a lot of leaders, is how do I lay the groundwork so that people can get over these things we've been talking about in order to have difficult conversations? You hear a lot of leaders talk about how they feel like they're not getting the straight answers or straight feedback from people because people are afraid of challenging someone in a position of power. So then the question is, how do you make yourself disagreeable with, right? How do you make it okay for people to actually disagree with you?
How do you?
So number one, I remember actually talking to this CFO who was working with his team, who, he said, he's like, "I just don't understand. Like I've done, I've said to them, I want the feedback. I want to hear what you said. All opinions matter. There's no bad question. There's no. And I said, "Oh, okay. In what format did you say that?" He's like, "I said it at our offsite 2 years ago." And I was like, oh, okay. I was like, yeah, that you have to say it pretty much every day. Like you have to demonstrate it. And I think that's one of the things you really have to over and over just demonstrate, not just say, I want you to disagree with me, but demonstrate. And when someone does disagree with you, right? Say, Amy came to me. She had this difference of opinion about the, budget we discussed last week. It took courage for her to say that she didn't see it the same way I did. And I'm really glad she did. Because of it, this is what happened, right? And you can say also, it doesn't have to be an example where you actually agreed with the person, but you can say, Amy and I went back and forth on this. And ultimately, I still believe this, but I'm really glad we had the conversation, right? So trying to just make sure people understand, not just, hey, I want to hear the feedback, right? I had this boss once who would do this thing. He would, at our annual performance review, he had high standards. I learned so much from him. Your performance reviews were a little brutal. You just knew you were going to get a lot of feedback. Let's just put it that way. And at the end, so you're sort of sitting there like sweaty and exhausted from this intense performance review. He'd go, do you have any feedback for me? And it was like,
Right.
how could anyone in this circumstance give you feedback? So I think you have to really make sure you're asking at the right moments. And sometimes it's not even this generic, hey, you can disagree with me. It's saying, let's go around the room. I want to hear from everyone. Where do they stand on this, right? Or even stopping by someone's desk and saying, I got the sense from your body language that you weren't totally on board. I really want to know what you're concerned about, because your concern, it'll be critical for us to address your concerns if we're going to move this forward, right? Just trying to find ways to really not just invite, but draw out the feedback from people. But the real key thing is how you react in the moment. You've probably heard this phrase too, of like a leader's whisper is heard as a shout. And when someone disagrees with you, laser eyes are going to be on you to see how you respond to that. And if you don't respond well, which for some people is sort of a reactive way of handling the situation, if you don't respond well, that's okay. Don't beat yourself up, but come back, right? And just say, you know what? I got a little defensive in this last meeting about that. That was not the right approach. What I really wanted to hear is I wanted to hear more about that. But I was so stuck in my own thoughts at that moment that I couldn't get around it.
That can be even more powerful in a way than having the right reaction in the moment, because how you come back from something like that and actually you admit that you've made a mistake and that you were defensive, I think it humanizes you. And it also shows that you really are actually responsive and reflecting on what people are telling you. So in a way, and I think it goes back to the same mechanism probably that has been discovered around how companies actually build customer loyalty. And apparently one of the moments where you build customer loyalty is when something goes wrong, and around how the company then deals with that mistake. And often when the mistake is being dealt with really well, it is more powerful than if nothing has ever happened. And I think I've seen leaders who make mistake and then come back to the team and admit it. I've seen how appreciated that has been. So I can only imagine that's super, super powerful. And in a way, it's great because it takes pressure off us to be perfect in every moment, right?
I mean, there's so many things that you're doing in that moment, right? Like you're signaling that it's okay to disagree with you. You're demonstrating humility. You're demonstrating a growth mindset, and you're demonstrating that you're infallible. And as you just said, you're giving yourself permission to not get it right every time, which I think is such a trap for leaders. And I think so much bad behavior, cutting off conversations, being cold toward your employees, micromanaging, right? All of that, I think a lot of that stems from this need to feel like you have to be perfect. And in fact, being perfect is terrible for your team, right?
Personally.
And I think, it's a funny thing to say, but it's true. Like because they're humans, they're not perfect, and nor are you. And to pretend you are, I think it's just really damaging to the entire team culture.
Totally. So number one thing that we need to do to create that psychological safety and get people speak up is to be a role model of what it looks like, right? To be open to feedback and to create that environment where it's pretty clear that it's okay to disagree. It's okay to point to flaws and so on and so forth. What other things can leaders do for their team members to speak up or for the team members to navigate conflict themselves? One of the things that you've mentioned when we did our pre-interview conversation is that leaders also struggle with helping people navigate conflict in their teams. Like people will come and say, hey, our guy is really tough to work with. I can't stand her. And it's, she's so stubborn or whatever it is. And then basically the monkey suddenly is on your shoulder. And it's such a difficult moment because how you behave in that situation, what you do, how you deal with that conflict is going to have an impact. And also the question is, should you even step in? And if not, like, what are the other options that you have? What do you think of that?
I mean, I think it's such a critical moment for a leader of like, how do you handle conflicts that are brought to you? And always you should be coaching first, right? And if you're interfering right away, or intervening is probably the better word, right away, then you're not teaching your team that A, conflict is okay, right? Or B, that they have the capacity or the authority to deal with it themselves. So, I think the very first question is, okay, what do you want to do about it? What have you tried? What do you think would work? Right? Just trying to understand the situation and encouraging them to try things and continue to use you as a sounding board. Okay, if you had a direct conversation, what would that sound like? What concerns do you have about that? Okay, why don't you try it and then come back to me? We'll debrief it. There's a 4-step framework from the book on dealing with conflict that I use for individuals, right? Is to understand the other person, know what you're disagreeing about, what's the type of conflict, know what your goal is, and then decide how to proceed. But you can use those 4 steps as a coaching tool too, right? So when they come to you, first question is, what do you think's going on for Aga? What do you think's going on for her? What does she care about? And then, okay, what's the disagreement really about? What's the essence of it? Okay, what's your goal? What do you want from this situation? Okay, what are some options for how you could proceed? Which of those seems like the best to you? Right? Just use it as a coaching tool to get them. That's the other sign of a really healthy culture, is that disagreements are resolved at the level at which they happen. Now, of course, that assumes clear expectations, right? Clear strategy. That's a whole other issue. But assuming you have that, for people to resolve those issues at the level at which they exist is a really wonderful thing. And for people to hold each other accountable. If we go back to the interrupting example, if you come in every time and go, no interruptions, no interruptions, what happens when you're not in the room? Does that brilliant jerk just interrupt people left and right? You have to allow people to learn and to try out their own keeping one another accountable.
Yeah, it's such an important point because I think you can only really say that something has been embedded in your culture when these behaviors happen when you are not in the room as a leader. And the only way for that to happen is if you invest some time, as you say, in coaching your team members around how to do it. And it's such an important thing because we often think of culture as this abstract thing and the thing that requires major interventions if you want to change it. But actually, it can be as simple as, instead of intervening, just sitting down with someone and helping them think something through and then try it out in their relationship with someone.
Oftentimes people come to you because they think it'll be easier if you just intervene. And so, and it might be more efficient in some ways, right? But then the problems are just going to keep coming back to you. As a leader, do you want to spend your time intervening every time people can't agree on like the format for the project plan or whatever the disagreement, do you want to just keep getting involved? I'm guessing no. Now, there are times you do need to get involved, and you do need to make sure expectations are clear, right? That people have clear roles. There's not sort of competing interests on the team that is going to create a conflict over and over. The other thing I think that can be really helpful, speaking of competing interests, is naming what are normal tensions on a team. So perhaps you and I get into it all the time, right, about something. If our leader can say, you know what, this is a good conflict to have because One of you cares a lot about speed, which is great, and efficiency. The other of you cares about quality. I'm not surprised you're getting into it all the time. That makes sense. And that's a good tension for us to continue to navigate. It's not going to be comfortable all the time, but I hope we'll continue to have these discussions, right? Just naming the tension for what it is so that you can help the team continue to navigate.
And framing it as something positive, I think that's incredibly important as well, because for me, based on the observations that I've had, is what's true also about conflict is that there is a lot of shame involved, shame and guilt. I think we feel like ideally we shouldn't be having this conversation. Like we should agree, as you say, it should be all harmonious and nice. And the fact that we're actually disagreeing, it makes someone wrong and someone right. And what if it's me who's wrong or whatever? And I think a lot of people carry a lot of shame and a lot of guilt about engaging in conflict and disagreeing. Having a leader who can actually frame it as something desirable, I mean, how powerful is that? I wish I had a leader like that in my career. Unfortunately, I didn't, not around conflict. I had a lot of great leaders, but no one who would frame conflict this way for me. I can totally see what an impact this framing can have on a team.
I've actually worked for someone who did say that, who really was like conflicts positive. This is what, but then anytime it came up, she froze. And it was so interesting because you were like, oh, it's not okay. This is not okay. Like you're saying it's okay. And I think that's the other thing is you really have to work as a leader to believe it. And it's okay to freeze occasionally. And as long as you are clear, I shut down that conversation with my body language. That's not what we need to be doing. We need to be having these conversations.
Such great insights around what leaders can do to lay the foundations for a culture where conflict is seen as something desirable or people can navigate it in a way that leads to positive outcomes. Is there anything else that leaders who listen to this might benefit from when it comes to thinking about conflict and cultivating a culture where conflict is dealt with in a constructive way?
Just to build on what we were just talking about, sort of naming the tensions, I do think it's saying, to say, here are the conflicts we should be having. We should have disagreements over how long something takes, whether we emphasize quality or efficiency. We should be having disagreements over whether we prioritize the customer over the company. We should be having disagreements over whether we prioritize revenue over our mission, right? These are the conversations we want to be having. And then empower your people, right? To name those, right? Just to say, okay, whoa, this is getting a little tense. What do you think's going on here? What's the essence of our disagreement? It takes practice, right? That's something, giving your employees language in with which to have this conversation. I mean, I've done talks on conflict. I actually remember this one I did at this tech company, and this woman was standing in the back. I could tell based on sort of the way people interacted with her, she had quite a position of power. And she came up afterward and she said, oh, I'm an executive at this company. And I said, oh, and she said, everything you said, I knew already. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, sorry, and she said, but I don't do any of it. It's really important. As a senior leader, it's you often know these things, but you don't actually do them. And your team members often know these things and maybe don't do them. So what I find really helpful is to have frameworks, right? These 4 steps for analyzing a conflict, right? Before you have the conversation. Then you can coach someone through that. Or if the team's getting it, it's like, okay, let's stop. Let's use these 4 steps, right? Giving them the language and the tools and the skills. Again, no one teaches us how to do this. So helping your team members acquire these skills so that they can do the things they know are the right thing to do, but are really hard to do, I think is another important step a leader can take.
I'm so glad that you've raised this issue of the gap between what we know and what we do, because it's very real, obviously. And I wonder whether one of the obstacles that you see with executives who know this stuff already and yet don't do any of it, whether there's also something around time, or at least the way they perceive the time they have available, and basically feeling like I can't really afford investing in this right now because, my schedule is back-to-back meetings for the entire day. And if I were to sit with my team member and coach them on how to navigate conflict, I would have to cancel 3 of my meetings. And I wonder, A, whether you see it as an obstacle, and B, what is the way to think about it or what to do about it if indeed it is the reality that someone is experiencing?
I think you've hit the nail on the head because it's about, well, time and stress, right? I will say, I think the reasons people often don't do the things they know they should is they don't have time or they're too stressed, right? They're in this sort of survival mode and they cannot get out of that way of thinking of like, I mean, you really cannot be in survival mode if you're trying to change behavior. So in terms of time, this is not going to be surprising to anyone. Like, I'm a big believer that canceling those meetings to coach your employee through a conflict is super stressful, but it's going to save you many, many more hours down the road when they're actually start to solve their own conflicts, right? And I think the part of what's the limiting belief for leaders is they don't actually believe people can do that. So they think I'll put the time in and it'll still come back to me. Why would I even bother? And you have to believe that people can change. You have to have this growth mindset. You have to believe that it maybe not won't happen right away and it maybe won't be linear even, but by putting in the time, you're doing the right thing to lay the groundwork to save you a lot of time later. The other thing is if your business, and I hate saying this because I know most businesses operate this way, but if your business is operating to the point where you don't have the capacity or the space to do some development and think about how the team works together, you need to rethink how you run your business. While I recognize it's the reality, you are not going to grow, achieve your long-term goals if you're not able to spend time on how you work, not just what you're producing, but how you work. And, sometimes you need to outsource that. Maybe you don't have the skills. That's the other thing I think a lot of leaders don't spend the time coaching because they don't know how to handle conflict. They're like, how would I possibly coach someone? I'm so conflict averse, or like every conflict I have ends up in a fight, right? So they don't even feel like they have the skills. So I think you might have to outsource it to someone who's an expert at this. You might have to bring in other resources. You might have to stop doing some things for temporarily in order to actually fit in the time to do this. But I mean, you and I in our work understand the dividends it pays in the long run. Yes, there are a lot of trainings. There's a lot of sort of initiatives around the stuff that are a waste of time. I don't want to imply that they're all going to end up in the results you want. But I think if you're discerning and you really make smart choices about how you do this, you're not going to feel like it was wasted time.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that for a lot of leaders, when they start thinking about how difficult a growth leap is in terms of growing the business, they'll realize that often it feels like you cannot afford to do certain things until you get to the next stage of growth. And yet you take that leap because you know it's an investment in your business's future. And you can really apply the same thinking to growing your team and helping your people navigate various situations that work better. It will require some upfront investment on your part, but it is exactly that. It's an investment. So thinking about it in these terms, I hope that it's going to be helpful to some of the leaders who are listening to this, or
Me too.
yeah, some of the HR people.
I also say to those leaders, like, you have my deepest empathy about how hard it is and about how frustrating it is. You probably have made some strides in this area just to find that they didn't work. Things like psychological safety or a healthy culture. Unfortunately, it's not something like you spend a year on and you get a certificate and then you're like, oh, good, we have a healthy culture. We have a psychologically safe culture. It's something you have to constantly be maintaining and developing. And the business changes, the external circumstances changes, your people change, right? So then it's unfortunately or fortunately, I mean, I see it as a privilege to get to work on these things. It's something you're going to be working on always.
Love the reframe here. We get to do those things. And I think being a leader is such a such a privilege because you really get an opportunity to have an impact on people's lives. And we all know that work jumps the fence and follows people home. And so it's not just about professional development and success, but it's also about the quality of people's lives if we can create a better environment for our teams. And so absolutely. You get to do this and it's exciting. It's hard. It's frustrating as you say, but it's also incredibly fulfilling when you see the impact. Amy, I really wish that we had more time to discuss this. We have to do it again at some point in the future, but for now I want to be respectful of your time. So let's shift gears really quickly. We have this tradition here on the show that we do a rapid fire questions session at the end. And it's a series of 5 questions in rapid succession. The challenge for you is to answer all 5 in under 2 minutes. So it's going to be super quick, a sprint.
As listeners now have learned, I'm not a short talker, so I'm going to do my best.
All right, let's go for it. So at CultureBrained, the company that I run, we're on a mission to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. And I'm curious, what would be your number 1 tip to bring more belonging to the workplace?
Oh, no surprise there. Normalize conflict. Accept that conflict is inevitable, and your team has to be able to navigate difficult conversations if everyone is going to feel like they're going to belong.
What is the sign, or perhaps multiple signs, that a company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Yeah, I mean, I think the silence, right? Really having difficulty drawing out thoughts, opinions, beliefs from people is a big one. It's often, this isn't a sign, but you need to be asking your people what they think of the culture, right? And so ideally, you're finding ways to actually ask the question and hear directly from people how things are working.
Here. Are there any companies that you admire for the culture? And if yes, why?
Oh gosh, this is so hard because it's when you're outside a company, it always looks great, and then you talk to people and you're like, oh, actually, yeah, no, that's not so great. I'm going to take a pass on that one because of that reason.
Fair enough. What are the books that you would recommend to our listeners? And they don't have to be obviously, my recommendation would be to read your books, but they don't have to be books on culture or leadership. Anything really that you believe would be helpful to people in thinking differently about cultivating a thriving workplace.
2 leadership books I would recommend. One, there's a new book out from Amy Edmondson, who coined team psychological safety, called The Right Kind of Wrong. It's all about failure and mistakes. Highly recommend it. Also, Ruchika Tulsian, who's a DEI author and consultant, wrote a book called Inclusion on Purpose, which I just think it should be required reading for leaders, especially those who care about belonging. And I'll throw in something that's not a book, but I also think watching Ted Lasso is I mean, I think if you want to learn about emotional intelligence, psychological safety, like that show it's just such a great model of how you can build teams.
So true. So to wrap it all up, Amy, what is a question that I haven't asked you but should have?
I mean, it's funny. I don't know where this question's coming from, but the thing that pops into my head is, what if you're just too tired to do all of this?
Oh my God, this is such a real question. Please speak to this a little bit.
First of all, you and every other leader are really tired right now. It has been a rough few years. So one, I think just give yourself a break. And I think before you do you won't do this work well if you're tired, if you're exhausted, if you think of this as like one more initiative you have to do. So I would really work on self-compassion. I actually listened to a great podcast recently, Hidden Brain, which I love, had Kristen Neff, who's a compassion researcher on, and I love her work. And I think just starting there by like being kind to yourself, understanding if you haven't done this yet, it's not the end of the world. You can start at any point, right? And just sort of start there. Like give yourself some self-compassion. Once you sort of have a little bit more energy for it, then take it on. But I really don't think you can do it well if you're just completely tapped out.
Amy, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really so incredibly enlightening. And and so incredibly useful. I'm sure that our listeners are going to appreciate everything that you've shared with us. And I know that they are probably going to want to learn more about you, your work, read your books. I know that you have a new LinkedIn course that has just come out. So what are the best places for people to check all of the great work that you are doing out?
Yeah, so the LinkedIn course is just out and it's very relevant to this conversation. It's about managing team conflict. So if you go to LinkedIn Learning and search my name or that phrase, you'll be able to find it. I have 2 other LinkedIn Learning courses as well about managing conflict in remote environments, as well as disagreeing with someone who's more senior, which is a very popular course, and for better or worse. Almost everything links to my courses, my talks. To sign up for my newsletter, you can find at my website, which is amyegallo.com. Also, I encourage people to check out, I'm a co-host of a podcast called Women at Work from Harvard Business Review. And if you go to hbr.org, which is Harvard Business Review's site, I've written hundreds of articles. So if you just search my name there, you can find a lot of my work there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Amy.
Thank you. I so enjoyed this. I really did.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis El Labarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you so much for spending your time with Amy and me on this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found this chat insightful, inspiring, or useful, and I'm guessing you did since you're still here, do me a solid, take a few seconds to share this episode and have a chat with someone about what you learned. Because when podcasts like this spark conversations, and those conversations turn into actions, that's when we start making real changes in the workplace together. And if you're looking to dig deeper into these topics and connect with others who are shaping the culture within their organizations, consider joining CultureBrained. We put together a cohort of the best, most ambitious culture leaders to help them accelerate progress in their culture work. To find out more and apply, head over to tinyurl.com/culturebrained. The link is in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabajer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.